Hey, you made it. You made it back to the channel. How you feeling? This has been a pretty intense week. It was different than 2016. In 2016, we didn't really think it could happen, and then by the time we realized it was happening, it pretty much had already happened. This time around, we went into it knowing that it could happen, and for a while there, it kind of felt like it was happening, and then we had to wait around for 4 days to see whether or not it had happened, which kind of begs the question, what the hell happened? The most difficult part about trying to discuss what happened is that it's not done yet. There's way more dust left to settle before we truly understand what happened. There'll be plenty of time to talk about the polling or demographic shifts or policy takeaway or what might happen in the future, but it would be irresponsible to try to deal with any of that while so much data is still coming in. Also, just like you, I spent most of the week just trying to keep track of everything. So let's just talk about what went down, and maybe in the process we can start to wrap our heads around this week. First and foremost, it's important that we take a step back and really absorb the most important outcome here. Joe Biden won the election. All of the lying, all of the corruption, all of the nonsense rhetoric, the orphaning children at the border, the incompetent response to the pandemic, the attempts to undermine the law, the attempts to take away people's health care, the attempts to take away people's financial assistance, the vacant appointments, the non-functioning regulators and agencies, the firing of inspectors general, the obstruction of justice, dividing America between red states and blue states, the attempts to pull funding from our communities and cities just because he thinks they don't like him, the declaring states of emergencies in order to build a wall, the covering up for overseas dictators when they murder journalists, the bullying of our allies, the breaking our word on international treaties. All of that ends in January. We can get back to focusing on good governance. We have a president who will read his briefings again. We have a president who will attend cabinet meetings instead of spending all day on executive time and watching Fox News. A serious person is headed back to the Oval Office, and that is worth a huge sigh of relief, if not a full-on celebration. All right, now that that's out of the way, let's take a look back on this week. There was a wide range of expectations going into Tuesday night, spanning from Trump supporters who were absolutely certain that he would win, to the liberals who were paranoid that he would win, to the people who thought it was a true toss-up, to the folks like me who predicted a Biden landslide. Well, it was clear pretty early on that the latter group, we were wrong. As soon as the Florida counts started to come in, we began to see a shift towards Trump among Hispanic voters. This caused a dent in Biden's support in Miami-Dade County that he would never recover from. Florida was a toss-up from the beginning, but many voters were expecting it to be way closer than it was looking, and that made a lot of folks very nervous right out of the gate. However, plenty of us knew that the Hispanic population in Florida is composed differently than it is in other states. Specifically, there are a lot of Cubans in Florida, and Cubans are probably the most conservative Hispanic demographic. So while Florida showed that the race would be tighter than we thought, it didn't provide clear indications as to how much tighter. Then another reckoning came when the Senate race in Kentucky was called really quickly as Mitch McConnell handily beat Amy McGrath. This simultaneously brought into focus several questions. Was this the first example of voters leaning towards more centrist Democrats in the primary, hoping to appeal to moderate voters, only for that to be in vain? Was it the first example of a place where Democrats wasted millions of dollars in donor money on a race that we should have known was doomed from the beginning? These questions repeated themselves as candidates like Lindsey Graham and Susan Collins went on to win their races as well. Plenty of people, including myself, were extremely skeptical that McGrath ever had a real shot at beating McConnell. But I want to be absolutely unequivocal here. We want Democrats fighting in tough districts. We get into serious trouble when we start deciding that congressional seats are lost causes. We should be competing for every single seat in the country, all of them. The systemic disadvantage that we're trying to overcome is just too prominent for us not to. We have the passion and we have the money. We should spread it over all 50 states. Losing simply isn't a good enough reason to say that that money was wasted. Every voter in America should be hearing our message and have somebody to vote for. Then Texas numbers started to come in. Things looked decent at first, but it wasn't long before we saw a similar trend among Hispanics. It wasn't as distinct as in Florida, but it was enough to offset any gains that Biden was making in more white suburbs. While Biden performed well in the areas around Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, and El Paso, it wasn't going to be enough. The trends among Hispanics prevented anyone from feeling comfortable about Biden's chances in Nevada or Arizona. So even if Biden managed to split Georgia and North Carolina, it was going to come down to the blue wall. At the time, it looked like Biden would lose both Georgia and Carolina. So all eyes turned to Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and of course, Pennsylvania. A quick note before we move on, I want to mention that by and large, the coverage of the election by the large news media networks was terrible. They were reporting on results from states before they had 50% or even 15% of the vote, which was bound to add to this narrative that the vote was changing over time. Yeah, the count changes over time, but not the votes. Those all happen pretty much at the same time. Framing the count as Biden's in the lead and then Trump's in the lead or vice versa is confusing for everyone. This isn't a football game. The score doesn't happen in a linear fashion. It's irresponsible to cover it like it does. In general, I thought NBC probably did the best job. They were much more careful about being observant and speaking in terms of projections instead of absolutes. In short, they just took it more seriously. But now we're in a position where it's Saturday and everybody knows who won and they still haven't made a call. Get your shit together, guys. But back to the timeline. Around this time, John Hickenlooper defeated Cory Gardner in Colorado and gave Democrats their first flip in the Senate. But it was starting to look like this would be the exception, not the rule. Democratic representatives that had earned narrow victories in 2016 were dropping like flies, and Republicans were stacking up wins in Senate toss-ups. John Cornyn easily beat MJ Hagar in Texas. By the way, the fact that Beto ran for president instead of that seat will never not annoy me. Name ID matters. If you have a popular candidate from a purple state, run for Congress. Why be the 15th or 18th candidate to run for president? It's so annoying. And another thing, progressive has been a perfectly sufficient label for the left wing of the Democratic Party since the turn of the century. Does anyone really think that Teddy Roosevelt or Henry Wallace or Charlotte Bass was too centrist? I do not understand why we are willingly tagging ourselves with a label that includes the word socialist when most of them aren't even real socialists. And progressive works just fine. There are few words more toxic than socialism. We don't need another socialism. I know that democratic socialism is different than socialism, but when we're explaining nuances like this, we're losing. Same with messaging like defund the police. I made an entire video about defund the police, so you can look at that for my views on it, but my point is that we make ourselves easy targets with messaging like this. House and Senate candidates got killed over this messaging. I don't think it really affected the top of the ticket that much because Biden did a pretty good job of tamping it down, but it looks like it absolutely had a drag on down ballot candidates. We need to pull our heads out of the sand on this. Like I said, it's still early and we don't have great data, so it's hard to know just how much of an effect this had. But being clear and concise about issues that voters can see and feel is more important than being catchy or having slogans that fit nicely on a protest sign. I'm endlessly thankful for the protesters that got out there and made themselves heard over the summer. In many respects, they were speaking for me too. But we need to be mindful that the messaging that works in a West Coast city will be used against our candidates that we need to win in Utah or Nebraska. All right, but before we get all doom and gloom about how Democrats performed in Congress, I think we should also be honest about what Republicans actually accomplished here. The trend of electing non-serious people in Congress that started with the Tea Party has only gotten worse. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Madison Cawthorn both won their races. Greene is a far-right QAnon conspiracy theorist, anti-Semite, racist, and xenophobe. She's called George Soros a Nazi, and she said that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib were part of the Islamic invasion of our government. This is a screenshot of her Twitter feed. She's radical, she's extremist, and she's completely divorced from reality. But now she's in Congress. Cawthorn started to gain national attention when he posted his trip to Adolf Hitler's vacation house on Instagram. where he referred to Hitler as Führer and said that the trip had been on his bucket list for a while. He eventually deleted the post and denounced white nationalism, but later it was revealed that on his campaign website, he attacked a journalist for what he called working for non-white males in reference to Cory Booker. This, by the way, is in addition to the several women who have accused him of sexual assault and misconduct. When he won, he had the grace and modesty to post this. These people are clowns, and they don't belong in federal government. Democrats need to make sure that we're continuing to give people in these districts respectable candidates to vote for. And we need to message to them, and we need to campaign and organize around them really hard, because these people really shouldn't be hard to beat. So as the evening crept on, we all started to realize that what we had been warned about for months coming up to this election was starting to come to fruition. The election would not be decided anytime soon. Then things started to get ugly. Donald Trump began tweeting about how the election was being stolen from him and gave this absolutely insane press conference that had the singular intent of upending this election. He telegraphed it plenty, but I think a lot of us still had some irrational hope that he would be an adult in the face of defeat, but that was not the case. As Hillary warned us about in 2016, Donald Trump has never lost anything without accusing the entire process of being unfair. All week, the president has been filing lawsuits and making accusations of fraud without providing even a shred of evidence. It's been really, really embarrassing, and it's really, really dangerous. I honestly don't even want to talk about it other than to say I'm really glad we're kicking him out. By Wednesday morning, it became clear that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota would hold for Biden, and his path to victory only solidified from there, culminating on Friday morning when we learned that he would take Georgia and Pennsylvania. As I said, I'll be making videos diving deeper into the implications of this over the coming weeks, but I want to give a few broad takeaways of the election, kind of my initial thoughts, if you will. First, I'm already seeing liberals question how much of a mandate Biden has because they felt like the election was close. Stop it. The only reason why this election felt close is because Republicans forced a situation where ballot counting would take way too long than it needs to be, and because the Electoral College is extremely, extremely stupid, as is the Senate. At the time of this filming, Biden is on track to win 306 Electoral College votes, 50% of America's vote, with almost 75 million total votes. If the two Georgia seats go to Democrats, the Senate will be split 50-50, but the Democratic half will represent over 41 million more people than the Republican half. He has a mandate. We need to stop being so freaking meek about our goals. Biden won. We need to govern like he won. We need to start being confident about what we want to do and do it. It's a huge reason why the just get it done crowd prefers Trump. We're too timid. We need to pursue our agenda and deliver results for voters. Full stop. Second, black voters really saved our asses. I'm going to dive really, really deep into this, probably over multiple videos, but black voters delivered in the blue wall and they delivered in Georgia. It's not just their politics that Democrats need to pay more attention to, but also their strategies. Stacey Abrams knows what needs to be done. It isn't about perfect Goldilocks ideological approaches. Centrist Democrats and progressive Democrats both struggled in this election. It's not about money either. Funded and unfunded campaigns struggled alike. It's about organizing. If we want to win, we need to invest in permanent campaign infrastructure in districts across the country that are canvassing relentlessly and connecting with voters in person in their communities. Donald Trump started campaign right after he won in 2016, and we need to do the same. It's 2020. Campaigning never ends. There are no days off anymore. This was all about turnout. That's it. In places where Republicans upset expectations, it wasn't that the Democrat didn't turn out voters, it's just that the Republicans turned out more. Sure, Joe Biden broke records for how many votes were cast for him, but so did Donald Trump. We need to convince voters that we have their backs. We need to make sure that they have access to voting, and then we need to make sure that they vote. It isn't rocket science. Politicians like Stacey Abrams and Katie Porter know how to do this. Give them the damn keys. And finally, I think I have something approaching a unified theory about what happened and why we're so surprised. Donald Trump tried his best to recreate 2016. He tried to make Hunter's laptop happen. He tried to make Beijing Biden happen. He so badly wanted another Hillary's emails, but he already had it. It just looked a little different. This election's Hillary's emails was the pandemic. Leading up to the election, it was common for people to opine about what this election would look like if the pandemic had never happened. Well, I think we have our answer. I think this is what it would have looked like. Voters simply didn't make Trump pay for his pandemic response. As weird as that sounds, I think it was a non-factor. At the end of the day, it seems like the only people who really blame Trump for how poorly we've responded were people that were already going to vote against him. Even though so many people have died and so many people have got sick, he managed to both sides of the issue. He managed to run against the shelter-in-place orders successfully enough to convince median voters that there's nothing he could have really done differently. He made it us versus them. He made us a pandemic that was inevitable and was going to happen anyway, and them being strict politicians who wanted to take away your freedom using fear. I know it sounds ridiculous, and that's because it is ridiculous, but I also think that it's true. Democrats messaged plenty that he failed, but they didn't do a really good job explaining what he should have done differently. And I'll admit, it's a really hard thing to do. It's a battle that we're always going to be fighting. It's always easier to argue for doing nothing than doing something, because doing nothing is easier than doing something. He neutralized the consequences of his incompetence by doing what he always does. He flooded the zone with bullshit. We shouldn't be surprised. Frankly, we shouldn't be surprised that so many people voted for him. He's a populist demagogue. This is what populist demagogues do. They lie about whatever they need to, and they promise whatever they need to in order to stay popular with their base. And their base usually accepts the lies because the demagogue is popular with them. That's how it works. That's why populist demagogues are so dangerous. The longer it takes to get a populist demagogue out of power, the more dangerous they get and the less likely that you'll ever get them out of power. And that's why Biden's win is so important. Plenty of democracies fail to get the populist demagogue out in time, and it leads to their demise. It looks like we might have dodged that bullet. And before I forget, it looks like we're getting 2 runoff Senate elections in Georgia. These runoffs will probably decide whether or not Mitch McConnell gets to harpoon Biden's presidency. So all of that enthusiasm we had for Jamie Harrison, all of that money that we sent to Amy McGrath, double it down for Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, because they're going to need it. For the next 2.5 months, it's all eyes on Georgia. All right, that's all I've got for you right now. Hopefully those thoughts weren't too scattered. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm exhausted. I'm sure you are too. But this is democracy. It's hard. It's messy. It's exhausting. But it's worth it. If I can leave you with one final thought, so much about what's happened to our discourse over the last 30 years, it really comes down to the fact that not enough Americans know enough about how we're governed, know enough about what our representatives do. But over the last 4 years, I've watched so many of you get more and more engaged over these questions. And we gotta continue that. Continue learning the ins and outs of how our system works. Continue learning about how different decisions that our representatives make affect your life, and invest in your knowledge about how our government works so that you're more prepared to know the difference between a good one and a bad one, and so that you're more prepared to convey that knowledge to your friends and your neighbors. Because in the end, that's the only shot we have at preventing this from happening again. And for my part, I'll be here doing everything that I can to help you in that effort. Let me know how you felt about the election. Tell me how it felt to you. We did it. We beat them. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next Sunday.